Good afternoon, everybody. Killian, McCarthy here. Thank you very much for joining the webinar on Supplier Management. I'm joined here by Garret, my colleague, and we will kick this off, and we won't be any longer than 35 minutes. So thank you very much for your time and attention and for joining. I know we've got people joined from all corners of the globe, all over the UK, Germany, US, and here in Ireland. So thank you very much for your time. So just to kick off, we're going to do a quick introduction and kind of background to Supplier Management. We're then going to do a quick demonstration of a few functions and areas. And if you have any questions, you can see on the bottom of your client, you can submit a question through the chat option at the bottom. So as many of you know, and we have the SoftCo Platform and SoftCo 10. And what we do predominantly in most of those areas is around procurement and AP automation. That's underpinned by our Amazon Web Service for our hosted platform. Some of our clients online here today would be on-premise, but we offer many clients a hosted offering. We're obviously a Microsoft Gold partner, and the next module we wanted to talk to you about today was around Supplier Management, which is on the right here. So in terms of, I suppose, the metrics we're looking to kind of gauge and measure ourselves on across a lot of the functionality around the finance AP processes is managing and analysing the spend and procurement, automating the whole P2P process, reducing the control and costs, but ultimately allowing the business to make better decisions through better control and visibility, offering a lower approval time, cost reduction that in terms of the timing and processing time associated with each invoice and purchase order process. The cost reduction of managing and maintaining that process is reduced, and ultimately allowing a better supplier relationship through a better P2P process, and then less supplier queries, that everyone has more information, more visibility throughout the process to allow better supplier relationships. So taking on that to the next level, we've been doing a good bit of digging and research in relation to the whole supplier management area and world. And when you look up all the different reports and various functions, everybody and all the research is pointing to, can we get a better supply chain? Can we improve the supplier relationship? And if you go down to the bottom of the report here from Level Research, it's saying response time to supplier inquiries is a big thing that people are looking to address, the burden of inquiries to organisation. So the bottom two are very much driven by AP activity, and where you have an AP automation process in place, you get better control, better information, better visibility. You should be able to impact those. The supply chain efficiency and supplier relationships, they're kind of overarching comments, I think, and overarching functions. What we're trying to focus on is how do we get better information and how do we give the supplier a better experience. Transparency and communication with suppliers can be quite interspersed. It can be through email. Some people have different portals, different processes for different types of suppliers, whether you've got retail, goods for resale, trade suppliers, or your service-based suppliers, and often you get suppliers with different experiences, so you're trying to make that more uniform. I think the middle bit here, where we're looking at improving supplier validation and reducing risk and compliance, this is a big area that everybody is suffering a lot from, and I think the more and more we've asked with a lot amongst our customer base and seen more and more in the industry, this is the one area that's hitting companies hard in terms of managing the process, managing the functions around it, and exposing the business to a lot of risk. So when we break down supplier management, high level, we're kind of looking at the blocks of information and the process and the number of interactions you have with the various suppliers. So your first interaction with many suppliers, and we would see it here, is when we have to fill out a new supplier vendor form with some of our customers. So the supplier onboarding process can be quite fragmented, can be very manual, so you can receive anything to a paper copy, to a website, to log on to an Excel spreadsheet, and you can see all of those areas, how they expose different processes, different functions in many areas. The information that you get back off that spreadsheet then has to feed its way into an organisation, get signed off, have associated documentation with it. that all leads itself back into, can we make the process better? Can the supplier have a better experience? Because often when they send back a new supplier request, nobody is familiar where it's actually gone. Is there additional documents required? How long does that process take? In many places in an AP world, sometimes invoices come into the AP process. The new supplier needs to be set up. The vendor only finds that out after a couple of days, and then when they submit the corresponding paperwork, they still have no idea when they're getting paid. So how do we make the supplier experience a lot more informative and a lot more streamlined so they have better information and the whole process hangs together better? The order and invoice lifecycle kind of stems on from that, is that when you're up and running, where are my orders, what invoices am I due to get paid on, is there queries, how do all of those present themselves? Is there any missing invoices in the system? Are we giving the supplier the correct information, saying we think we have 10 invoices on file, they think they're owed for 12? What's the best method and process to present that data to them? Further on from that, then it's performance and insights into, okay, what suppliers are taking a long time for us to process? Is there invoices that are very troublesome because they're not presented with the right information or the right data? Are we getting them in a peculiar format that stops an invoice process slowing down? And then are we paying to our terms? So us as a supplier, as a customer to our suppliers, are we paying the terms? Are we delivering on the contractual elements that we agreed to set up and upfront? So in the UK in particular now, there's the whole prompt payment performance and insights, where everyone has to manage and report what their invoice processing times are they paying terms? So that's becoming more and more common, and people are being measured on that a lot more from a procurement perspective so they can get better terms. And all of this information in manual-based processes is very difficult to collate. The last part, in terms of compliance and risk, that's growing dramatically in terms of, do I have the correct 1099? Do I have the correct W8, W9 documentation? In Ireland, do we have a tax clearance cert? In the UK, is there a HMRC regulation associated? It just depends on your jurisdiction. But also, a lot of this data is now expiring, so I'm presenting documents, but it's not valid for an indefinite period of time. So you're looking to see, how do I manage the associated documents with every vendor? How do I present a method for them to submit new documents? How do I alert them around documents that need to be resubmitted at a given time, so that it won't impact any supply chain activity in terms of issuing a PO, receiving an invoice, any of that stuff you're looking to address. So stepping on from that, I suppose I've talked briefly about kind of what are the key areas. So in many places, the supplier onboarding process is very much a manual function. So you've got to complete paperwork, you've got to amend it, you're tracking down the missing documentation, have you got the paperwork? But I think the biggest risk and process risk that people are seeing, I mentioned earlier on in Accounts Payable, that invoices are coming into the business and the supplier would not be set up. So if you've got a service-based supplier, say for recruitment or marketing, many companies are experiencing a lot of fraud and threats in relation to fake emails coming in, where you've got an email coming in very professionally laid out from an active vendor in your area. So it might be a printing company or an advertising company that you currently deal with. It will look exactly the same, but the things to be looking out for is that it might have a fake domain. It might have something in the email saying that your account will be turned off if you don't pay this immediately. There might be little things in it that are off-putting, but that you would not take much heed to, some maybe spelling mistakes. It might be signed off by their CEO or CFO, somebody senior in their business, with a good signature. The name would be correct. These are very, very difficult to detect, and they're becoming more and more common. And I think ultimately what we're trying to say is you shouldn't even consider responding to these, and the method and way of handling all these kind of fake emails is to have a standard process. Every payment request has to go through an invoice processing function. Every new supplier has to go through a new supplier setup process, because if they haven't gone through the standard process, we shouldn't be paying them. So when you look then at the other research from Level, where we saw where are you most vulnerable? It's in the payment process, in the vendor setup, in the invitation for quotes, any maintenance stuff. They're all the key areas where people are targeting around the fake email process, sending in random spurious requests, and people are looking, if you're under pressure and you have a lot of invoices coming through and you think you're behind on your payments, this is where you will start to consider these emails coming through, and you're not looking out for the little details on the emails, maybe as a fake domain or a fake signature. So, as I said, in terms of the compliance and risk, look out for the internal manual tasks. So if I get paperwork in, have I got segregation of duties? So the email comes back on a spreadsheet, or sorry, the document comes back on a spreadsheet on email back into your organization. It gets printed off. Is the person receiving this the person who's creating the new vendor? Are they doing all the validation checks around the bank account details being on headed paper and being signed off? Do you have two people doing that? If it's one, is there segregation of duties about creating the account on the actual ERP after? The fraud from external targets, as I said, the emails that I talked about, the fake suppliers, and the request for payments from external sources that you have no visibility of. We've seen in many cases in the last 6 months where people have been under pressure to make payments for various reasons at month end, and they've seen fake emails coming through from their own CFO. It's not actually an external source. It's actually prompted to say, "Dear Mr. Person in AP, can you please pay this unless we'll be cut off?" And it looks like it's an email from their own CFO, and they pay the invoice because it's seen as an internal email. They're often more risky because you don't want to get in trouble with your superiors for the various reasons of not paying invoices. Anything that doesn't fall within the process, question it. That's the only lesson. So reporting of the red flags. Why are people changing bank details? Why are people requesting? Why am I getting asked to pay for invoices outside of a standard process? Any of those things are very things that you should be conscious of. If it's not inside the standard process, present it to somebody, because anyone who acts outside of the standard process, it's usually caught as a red flag, a risk, and something that shouldn't be happening. The big thing with all of these is that your reputation as an organisation for paying invoices, the level of recourse in some places is quite good, but in some places you may lose the money, and it can be quite damaging. And we've have personal experience with some customers where they've paid 5-figure sums to organisations, and they are getting it back, but it's taking a long time. But just from a cash flow perspective, anything like that can be detrimental, and it's happening day in, day out, and everybody, I think, on the webinar today would probably know or have had some experience of it at a personal level or at a corporate level. So just going to the onboarding, what can we do to make that process better? So there's the pre-qualification registration. What certification do we need? So do we need a W8? Do we need a W9? Do we need tax documentation? Do we need bank-headed paper documentation? What standardized onboarding process can we put in place for any vendor, any function? They always have to follow the same process. What's the audit history? Who submitted the details? Who signed it off? Who processed the internal case when it comes through? And what visibility and alerts can we put on documents expiring, new vendor requests, the urgent matter of getting something done or through the process quite quickly? So that kind of feeds into, once you have all that up and running, where are we at with how do we get an efficient supply chain and management process? How do we present queries to our suppliers via portal? What kind of relationship information are we pushing out to them in terms of, are the POs active? Are the invoices due for payment? Can we give them better methods to submit an invoice? Can they do a PO flip against the purchase order? The tracking and visibility alerts of all the data around any orders we've pushed out to them and any invoices. So just getting into the demonstration in relation to the whole process, we're going to jump into the demo quickly and give you an oversight on some of the dashboards that you have around supplier management, and then we'll come back to some of the onboarding stuff as well.
Okay, thanks, Killian. So what I'm just going to do is jump into the product just to show you First of all, as Killian said, some of the dashboard information that we have available. It's just a flavour of some of the information that we can collect around your suppliers, your spend with suppliers, the processes around that. So I'm just logging into the SoftCo 10 system, which I know some of you are already using. So within that, as you know, we've got a whole series of dashboards we can create and maintain. So for example, within the Supplier Dashboard here, we can see just some general supplier information in terms of, from an invoice processing point of view, so of interest to your AP team is, are there particular problem suppliers that you're either finding it takes a long time to process their invoices? You can also analyze delivery times, delivery response, accuracy of invoice to purchase order matching. So again, on this graph here, we can see the yellow bar is showing the invoices from companies where we're getting a very good straight-through process. So in other words, everything from order to shipment to invoicing is all very smooth without any problems, and you can start to identify, are there particular ones where that's not the case, or where you need to either use this as an impetus to go contact the supplier and get to the bottom of the problem, but again, putting in front of you information that will help you make better decisions as to who you need to interact with, who you need to engage with from a supplier point of view to get better performance from them, and as Killian said, ultimately get a better relationship with them. If you're all working together better, it leads to a better overall experience and ultimately a more efficient experience. And taking some of that a bit further, you can then start to derive some more high-level key performance indicators. Some of this, what I'm showing you here, is a mandatory reporting requirement in the UK around being able to report on your ability to pay suppliers on time, your payment to terms versus payment outside terms, which is not only important from a HMRC being able to report to them what your performance is, but also when suppliers are assessing you as a customer and the type of terms they're going to give you, they will now have full visibility of how well you perform with regards to payments. So the better you're able to perform, the more it puts you in a stronger position with regards to being able to get the best terms, the best pricing from your suppliers, in the knowledge that you're a good, efficient customer to them. So it works both ways from the supplier management point of view. So, as I said, that's just a flavour of some of the dashboards. There's a whole set of dashboards that the SoftCo platform allows you to gather data and present data on. I think, I suppose from today is just to be aware that we have access to a lot of the information, can report on it. What Killian's going to just give you a bit more of a view on is then when you start to get into the actual processes around suppliers, so starting with the onboarding process and how it can be done well or badly, if you like.
Yeah, so I suppose when we were sitting back looking at this, the onboarding process is one area I think that's very much a challenge for many organizations because it's a manual process. And I think there's two elements to the onboarding. One is getting the vendor set up initially, but two, the amount of requests for data updates, and we'll touch this again later, when changes to master data. So this is the first time you interact with the vendor, what's the data we present to them, and the second time is, and what information are we asking them. The way that's presented to the user at the moment is you receive an email with a Word document, a spreadsheet, or you potentially have to go to a web page that you fill out the details. But more often than not, it's an email or a Word document with some instructions set around that. This is one that I pulled just from a recent thing that we had to fill out here internally. Quite bland, quite basic. A couple of things to tally here, that when the information comes into the business, so when this, if I fill this information out as a supplier and sending it back to one of our customers, there's a couple of details on this that somebody internally in the business has to do something with. Predominantly the key in the details and validate the vendor details, but more importantly the bank details, the VAT number, the company code, validate all of those against the external sources. So some of those would be, can we validate our BIC and IBAN for European stuff, the bank account details or the SWIFT details in the US, or do we have to clash it against a sanction database? But as part of, when it's a Word document, we don't have that capability. If it's an online form or a standard function, we can present some of that validation real time, so that it eliminates, one, any fraudulent activity, but two, we can validate everything at source. So when the details are presented internally to the business for invoice or for vendor setup, everything is presented active and valid. So we can present that detail internally to an active person, and we know we've done a lot of pre-validation of that in advance. So that's kind of the thing. What we're trying to do is reduce the cost of onboarding of somebody, so that the internal function has a lot of the pre-work done, and the details that are being asked of and presented to the supplier is presented in a professional and structured manner, and that it allows everything to pull through quite effectively. So if you're going to jump to the process there, Garret. Sorry. So in terms of the supplier onboarding process, in many cases, somebody internally in the business has done a deal with an external supplier, or they're looking to get new product. So there's a new supplier request you can see here on the internal left-hand side. In many cases, that should go for a supplier management team review, so that somebody goes to somebody in finance saying, I want to get a new recruitment company, I want to get a new marketing vendor. So somebody reviews, do we need to deal with this vendor, or have we got an existing supplier? If the request is, okay, we need to engage with this supplier, we're going to present them to the supplier portal. They have to complete the registration form, and they complete all their details. When the details come back in, there's a whole management structure and function around, are the corresponding documents they submitted valid? Do we need to get any other additional supporting documents, such as additional header paper, something else from the bank, any of that? And following on from that, once we have all that, the accept is requested, and the whole vendor is ready to go and set up. We can create an output file that will create the vendor automatically in the corresponding ERP, be that Oracle, Navision, whatever the one. If you have a process or a method for that, we can output a file. If it doesn't, or there is an issue throughout the process, at any stage, we can alert the supplier and notify them to saying that the details they've submitted are invalid, and subsequently we need to get additional documentation, but it's all done through automated alerts and functions, and they have a standard function and process to come back to in terms of the supplier portal. So we're going to just show you some high-level features and functions, just and how we invoke some of the validations and what the process looks like. We're not going to do an end-to-end process just from a time perspective, just to give you an overview of how it all hangs together.
So just again, for users who might be familiar with the SoftCo 10 platform, all of the logging onto a single platform, so anybody who's currently using the system with the P2P elements involved will be familiar with the procurement orders and AP automation module. On this system here we have the vendors module, and this user here has the ability to create a new request. So they've identified a new supplier they wish to engage with. They can identify which org they want to engage on behalf of, or is it for the entire parent company. That's all down to user permissions. And then very simply we can just prompt them for whatever information is required at that point. So it can be just very simply, again, by design, this particular demo is cut back to the bare minimum in terms of information. It can be just fill out some very basic information. Let's call it new supplier Inc., the reason, new services, the email address as to what the email address they have for that contact in the supplier, in other words, who they want to get notification of the registration form, and then some general classification information. Are they a general supplier, goods for resale, whatever the case may be. And again, that can all be whatever information you prompt your internal users at this stage for is all configurable. As I said, by design, we've purposely kept this as simple as possible. Once they fill that out, that can then get routed for internal validation. So if we go back to our process flow, rather than have that go straight out to the supplier, you may want to have a step where you review that internally and say, yeah, okay, that is a new supplier, that is a new product that we want to engage with. Provided it passes that step, if I jump out to an email inbox here, just using a Gmail account, for example, at that point there, and only at that point there, will the prospective supplier get an invitation to say, you've been invited to register as a supplier. So they'll get an email. You can put whatever introductory information in that email you wish. Critically, though, they'll have a hyperlink that they can click on. Let me just grab the email address here. So by clicking on that link, let me get the right link there. First time they can just set up their password to get logged into the system. So this link is unique to them, and when they click that, complete that registration, what we do is we bring them straight into the vendor registration form that we've configured for you. So again, this is all configurable with regards to what information you want to prompt your suppliers for. So we can, very often you'll have an existing paper form with particular pieces of information. We can replicate that on the web form, but also we can add a lot more to it. So I'm just going to start filling this out. I'm not going to make you watch me fill out the whole form. As I said, we've deliberately turned off some of the validation, but if I just try, we can make certain fields mandatory. So you can see here, hopefully you can see there, fields that are required can be highlighted in red. And again, we can validate in terms of not only just that they're filled in, but they're filled in with valid information, and that's something I'll show you. So you can see here it's highlighted in red right down to bank account or Swift ID validation. Just to give you a sense of how that's set up, I'm just going to drop back into the internal view of the system, and what we're able to do is within the system we can create a whole set of what we call field validators. So for example, it has its own internal BIC validator, its IBAN validator, its VAT validator, so they can all be configured and turned on to go and validate the various data elements that you're looking for your supplier to provide. So if they are providing you with a VAT registration number, we can real-time go off and validate that that is in fact a real VAT number in Europe to make sure it matches who they say they are, etc. And we can go do back-end sanction list checks in the US, whatever the case may be. That's all configurable. So you get the idea. It'll mark in red any fields that have requirements around it. I'm just going to quickly fill out the required fields here. As I said, we've deliberately made this quite light in terms of the required information required for this form. Let me just grab a valid Swift ID. But again, once they've provided you with the information that you've deemed appropriate, at that point there they can submit that in. Sorry, I should have also showed you we can require that they submit supporting documentation, whether that be tax clearance certificates, W-8s, W-9s, proof of address, proof of incorporation, whatever your current requirements are, we can enforce that they submit those as attached documents as well. But at this point here, we filled out in our simplified example here for today, we filled out all the required information. That has now returned control back to the internal process. So if I go back to our internal process, we can do online automatic validation of certain information, and then we can get the supplier management team who can review that. So if we go back into the internal view, so I'm going back into the internal vendor's workflow or supplier workflow, that will get presented to users within the appropriate work queue here. So you can see anything that's just been submitted by a vendor, anything that's gone for your own particular reviews. This is an American based system, so it's looking for W9 review for US-based suppliers, W8 and FATCA review for external based suppliers, and you can see what's gone for final approval, etc. But if I just click into one that's just been submitted, what you have access to, if we pick this first one here, you can see all the data that the customer has filled in, sorry, the supplier has filled in, whatever that may be. And equally importantly, you can drill down and see any of the, oh, sorry, I picked the wrong one there. Any of the supporting documents that they've provided. So in this case here, we've just attached in the US, for example, a W9 form. But that can be a list of documents. It can be a preset checklist of documents that they have to fill out. But going back to Killian's point of view, at this point, Killian's comment earlier on, at this point here, we know where they are in the process. They're in a very defined point in the process. We can give them visibility of where it is. We can ensure that whatever checks can be automated are automated, and it's all kept there for future, not just posterity, but future reference and compliance, that you have all of the required documents before you get to the point where, once it clears your validation step, that provided the supplier team are happy at that point there, if they review it through whatever steps, and that can be a single step sign off or it can be a multi-step sign off. We have some customers where they want to send it off for ethical trading review, where they need to make sure that the suppliers are operating in a safe and ethical way, because it obviously impacts the reputation of that organization. Too, they need to make sure it's all the appropriate fraud and money laundering checks have been carried out. It's all down to whatever checks in whatever departments you want to involve in that process. That can all be configured. But ultimately, once you're happy, we can interface that supplier data across into your ERP, and they can now become an active supplier. And once they're an active supplier, if I just go back and log in, at that point there, that opens up the whole list of information and functionality that's available to them. So I've logged in as an active supplier. From here, as a supplier, I can see what orders have been issued to me by the customer. You can see what invoices are on invoice, and we can give them the ability to go and do what we call a PO flip, so submit their invoices against those orders directly via the portal. Once those invoices have been submitted, either via the portal or via the more traditional methods, we can give them visibility of what invoices are awaiting approval, what's awaiting payment. They can submit non-purchase order related invoices through the portal. And again, coming back to reducing queries, etc., they can see the status, what invoices have been paid, what's ready for payment. Again, giving the supplier better information, better contact with you, and again, even down to the point where there may be queries or where they need to update their profile information with change data. And that can be everything from address and contact information to more sensitive stuff that we can security control, such as bank account information. So they can access all of that here, provided they have the appropriate credentials. Anything that they submit, be it queries or profiles, can in turn then be presented back to you. So if I go back out to my internal workflow, so I'm jumping back in as an internal SoftCo user, not the supplier, but you as a SoftCo user, any data change request, which is obviously the critical and sensitive part. So we can see here any case where a supplier has gone onto the portal, changed their payment details, rather than have that on the basis of emails going back and forth, which are obviously prone to the fraud that Killian was mentioning earlier on. This instead is going through a controlled process where they can only do it by accessing the portal in a secure way. They can submit whatever they want, but it still has to go through the internal checks. So you can see here we can present both the current bank information and the proposed information that they want to change. We can provide a link to make sure that they've provided appropriate supporting documentation for those changes, so maybe a proof of the bank statement. And again, there's nothing to stop some further checks, even as simple as contacting the supplier in another way to validate, but the key thing is it's all going through a set standard process, and only at the point where your internal team are happy that that change is valid, is that change approved, and only then will the new payment information be assumed into the supplier account. So from that point of view, we believe that this, so for example, this change control process puts far more control and standards and visibility around any of those data changes, where at the moment there's a significant exposure and risk to things being changed on the back of an invalid email, or even cases where somebody has sent in a legitimate email. You don't necessarily just want people changing the bank account number without going through the appropriate checks and validations. So at that point there, you've seen an example of the onboarding, some of the ability of, once your supplier is onboarded, the information they can have access to, and on the back of that then how you can manage the data change control process within your organization as well. So I'll hand you back to Killian just to kind of summarise, I suppose, and leave it at that from a demo point of view.
Thanks, Garret. I suppose just to summarise this, we've been showing you some access to the portal there, some, as I said, onboarding process, viewing documents, changing data, all of that. One key factor is that many of our competitors and many people in the space, and is that there's a model that they charge customers to log on to a portal. There's no cost. This would be a cost between SoftCo and you as our direct customer. It's not directly, there's no third-party cost to any vendors. That's not a model that we operate. Outside of that, I think looking back at the original things we talked through about better communication, how do we reduce supplier queries in the business, how do we give better information to supplier of where stuff is, better information as to where maybe their new request is coming through for bank details. The portal is a method that they can log on and view and improve all that communication channel, and they can also then see where they are in terms of invoice payment, orders, submit new invoices, if there's missing invoices. They're all the benefits to a vendor. Internally, you for doing the data management and control, the onboarding process, that's a standard process to reduce risk and fraud and to reduce any likelihood of manual processes being broken, to offer and guarantee the segregation of duties from an audit control perspective. I think the takeaway point from all of that though is that with anybody we've spoke to around this process end to end, everybody says, but we've got vendors screaming at us to get paid, we've got this to do, we've got to change this bank details. In all the midst of all that, the time you're most susceptible to risk and to fraud and to making a fraudulent payment or doing something is when there's pressure to process an invoice, to process a master data change, or process a payment. And what we're trying to say to you is that's when you're most vulnerable, so step out of that world if you can, and always have the standard process. Don't be rushing to do something. If you're rushing to do something, that's when the people external think they have the greatest chance. You might get 100 requests in a month, you might get 100 requests in a year, but wherever they are in the timing, they only need one to go through to be effective. So it's the one that slips through the net, and if there's a lot of pressure at year end or month end, the manual processes facilitate the opportunity for something to go wrong and something to get paid. So it's just to take a look back and see, can I improve my invoice process? Can I improve my master data change? Can I improve my method and standardized process for making a payment? If it goes outside the standard channels, it's a red flag, and that's when you're obviously most susceptible to risk. That's it just for us, guys. I'm just conscious of our time. We said we'd be 40 minutes. We're just a little over that. Many thanks for attending. If you want to follow up with myself or Garret or any of the people directly, Adam or Trace, any of them, we're all available.
There is a questions window there, so if you have any questions, do submit them there. We're going to be here for a minute or a couple of minutes more if you wish to answer any questions, but as Kim said, other than that, we're happy to contact you individually and go through a more specific, personalised demo with regards to your own particular processes and needs.
Okay, thank you guys.
Thanks very much. Enjoy the rest of the day.